No one should have any doubt that the Valyrians and Targaryens are hybrid beings, not normal humans. When multiple members of your extended family give birth to babies with reptilian features, that's what that means. It's therefore not likely to be a coincidence that only the Valyrians and Targaryens in all the known history of the world have successfully bonded with dragons. And that does include Nettles. Check out my Nettles video, but that's not the point for today. The point is that some part of this dragon bond surely depends on the fact that there is a little bit of dragon in the Dragon Lord. The blood mages of old Valyria are indeed said to have been able to create human-animal hybrids with the darkest forms of blood magic. But beyond that, we're not told how they did it. And that's the disturbing and dark question that we're going to try to answer today. How did someone use sorcery, and who was that someone, to engineer a race of people with some small amount of dragon DNA in their blood? It turns out that by answering that question, we'll also arrive at a plausible theory to explain how dragons might have been first engineered from a magical crossbreeding of fireworms and wyverns. Essentially, if Dracomorph theory is true, then you're going to use the same mechanism for combining people and lizards as you do for combining fireworms and wyverns. That is, if you're a Valyrian blood mage with an extra freaky imagination. And I'm not. I'm just a YouTuber, a Song of Ice and Fire YouTuber, pretend mythology professor on YouTube, if you will. So gather around and let me tell you a tale of horror and fake magic science and of the secrets of the bloodworm. Alright, so how did all this Valyrian magical crossbreeding happen? Did George R.R. Martin really intend for it to be an impenetrable mystery? Or did he leave us clues about how they did it? First, let's briefly review what we know about Valyrian crossbreeding, which means it's time to mainline some Septembarth theory. So get your veins ready. It's a blood magic joke. In Septembarth's Dragons, Worms, and Wyverns, he speculated that the blood mages of Valyria used wyvern stock to create dragons. Though the blood mages were alleged to have experimented mightily with their unnatural arts, this claim is considered far-fetched by most maesters. Among them, Maester Vanyan, whose Against the Unnatural contains certain proofs of dragons having existed in Westeros even in the earliest of days, before Valyria rose to be a power. Alright, so Septembarth's theory here is pretty easy to follow. In A Song of Ice and Fire, wyverns, don't at me in the comments, in A Song of Ice and Fire, wyverns are essentially dragons without the fire, and perhaps with beaks more like a bird beak or a pterodactyl beak, but it's unclear. In any case, they are essentially dragons that have no fire, while fireworms are obviously worms that do have fire, and probably fireproof dragon scales, but probably not wings, and maybe not eyes or legs, or maybe they just got tiny little vestigial legs. Point is, they're worms, and they're fiery. So if you cross them with a wyvern, which is a dragon with no fire, then potentially you've got a dragon. Now, the excellent YouTuber Crowfood's daughter of the Disputed Lands channel, check her out, made a pair of terrific videos a couple years ago laying out in detail the best possible fleshed out version of this idea. So do check out those videos along with this one. And one of the very compelling points that Crowfood's daughter makes in her videos is that all the malformed Targ babies seem to be expressing either worm or wyvern traits. And in particular, you can see them reverting to worms of one sort or another. For example, Maegor's malformed children were sometimes born without eyes or without limbs, which makes them very worm-like. And along the same lines, there is a malformed dragon from Fire and Blood that also is very worm-like. So check out this quote from Fire and Blood. The first omen of the dark times to come was seen on Driftmark when the dragon's egg presented to Laena Velaryon upon her birth, quickened and hatched. Her parents' pride and pleasure quickly turned to ash, however. The dragon that wriggled from the egg was a monstrosity, a wingless worm, maggot-white and blind. Within moments of hatching, the creature turned upon the babe in her cradle and tore a bloody chunk from her arm. As Laena shrieked, Lord Oakenfist ripped the dragon off her, flung it to the floor, and hacked it into pieces. So Crowfood's daughter's explanation for what's going on here is that this worm, born from a dragon's egg, is essentially reverting to the DNA of one of its genetic parents, the fireworm. And I agree, I think that's exactly what's going on. And it's interesting to note that unlike the baby dragons placed in the cradles of most Targaryen babies, this worm creature attacks the child, Laena. And by the way, this is not the same Laena Velaryon from House of the Dragon. This is actually her granddaughter, the child of Alan Oakenfist Velaryon and Baela Targaryen. There's a lot of great stuff in those two Disputed Lands videos, but in the end, I think Crowfoot's daughter makes a compelling case that Barth is right, and that dragons were not a natural species, but rather engineered somehow through the magical crossbreeding of wyverns and fireworms. Another good piece of evidence for this theory is the fact that the author himself says that Septon Barth is usually right. So I think we're on pretty safe ground assuming that dragons were in fact created. Now, another important clue about this comes from the world of Ice and Fire, and specifically from the Basilisk Isles and the island of Gogassos, where they have those nasty Valyrian slave colonies. By any name, it was an evil place. The Dragon Lords sent their worst criminals to the Isle of Tears to live out their lives in hard labor. In the dungeons of Gogassos, torturers devised new torments. In the flesh pits, blood sorcery of the darkest sort was practiced, as beasts were mated to slave women to bring forth twisted, half-human children. Mated, as in intercourse? I suppose maybe you could sprinkle some dark magic on bestiality and imagine that it's going to lead to hybrid offspring, but somehow I don't think that's what we're talking about. It just seems a little too straightforward and not very much like blood magic. This is more like something the common folk would think of to explain the idea of human-animal hybrids. But it doesn't seem like something that would actually work to me, even with magic sprinkled in there. Just how would one coax a fireworm and a wyvern to make sweet, sweet love? You know, how does that work? And besides, they're totally different species, so even if they did, that wouldn't lead to a pregnancy. Now, I do think that the Valyrian blood mages were using blood magic to experiment with magical crossbreeding on Gogassos, but I do think those experiments were an attempt to rediscover, or perhaps expand upon, even older magical techniques, which were pioneered by the ancestors of the Valyrians in the Great Empire of the Dawn. You knew it had to be. So first of all, you'll recall the quote we just read about Maester Vanyan's Against the Unnatural containing certain proofs of dragons having existed in Westeros, even in the earliest of days before Valyria rose to be a power. Those proofs would almost certainly have to be dragon skeletons. I'm not sure what else would qualify as proof to these scientifically minded maesters. So they probably found some dragon skeletons somewhere in Westeros, and they might be cross-matching those with the 3 or 4 Westerosi legends of dragon slayers from the Age of Heroes or Dawn Age, such as Serwyn of the Mirror Shield, Galadon of Morn, Davos Dragon Slayer, and perhaps even Sir Clarence the Crab. Perhaps the clever Maester Vanyan even noticed the Fused Stone Fortress beneath the High Tower. That would certainly be proof of dragon presence in ancient Westeros. In any case, these potential Dawn Age dragons in Westeros, they could be wild dragons that escaped the Great Empire of the Dawn, but more likely they are, in fact, evidence of the Great Empire of the Dawn presence in Dawn Age Westeros. And check out the video Origins of Oldtown for more on that. So the picture that emerges is that the Valyrian crossbreeding that we hear about on Gogassos is probably something they learned from the Great Empire of the Dawn. One of the main narrative purposes of the Great Empire of the Dawn is that they were these mysterious first Dragon Lords and the ancestors of the Valyrians, so it does make sense that they would have been the ones to have crossed wyverns and fireworms to create the first dragons. And likewise, it makes sense that they would have been the first ones to crossbreed humans and reptiles of some variety to create Blood of the Dragon people. This implies that the Valyrians are actually an engineered race, likely engineered to interface with and control the terrible new dragons that the Great Empire of the Dawn sorcerers had made. Some of the Blood of the Dragon people must have survived the long night and the downfall of the Great Empire of the Dawn and made it to Valyria, where they created a new civilization and eventually flourished. They seem to have continued experimenting with blood magic and human-animal hybrid making, perhaps because they knew that was the secret behind their own power. Septon Barth, by the way, is also of the opinion that the first Dragon Lords came from Asshai and taught the Valyrians their arts before passing from the pages of history. So the Great Empire of the Dawn theory itself is actually just me attempting to fill in the details of Barth's hypothesis. So that's the larger timeline context for the creation of dragons and the creation of the Valyrian race. But the big unanswered question here remains, how is it done? How did the Great Empire of the Dawn mix the blood of the dragon into the bloodline of the people who would become the Valyrians? How did they combine fireworm and wyvern DNA? Alright, so as the title of this video suggests, it turns out that the key to the creation of dragons, as well as the blood of the dragon people, lies within the slimy double jaws of Ridley Scott's Xenomorph, which I'm sure everyone remembers from the popular sci-fi horror movie franchise Alien, as well as its sequels, Aliens, Alien 3, Aliens Resurrection 7, Alien vs. Predator in a pyramid under Antarctica, and my personal favorites, Prometheus, and all the cool shit that they deleted from Prometheus that you have to find on the internet. Shout out to Croft Talks About Movies. If you're a fan of Prometheus, you will thank me later, and please do so in the comments. So again, yeah, shout out to Croft. I've watched all their videos. And I'm also a big fan of Alien Covenant, the sequel to Prometheus, and perhaps the most underrated film of the franchise. One which accurately predicts the horrors of the AI future that the deranged techno freaks are trying to push on us. Shout out to Ridley Scott, he really cooked on that one. So the main star of these movies, besides the legendary Sigourney Weaver, of course,
get away from her, you bitch!
is the alien, which is known as the Xenomorph, from Greek xeno, meaning alien or strange or foreign, and morph, meaning to change, to transform, something like that. It's a kind of parasitic creature which seems to be able to combine its DNA with the DNA of its hosts in order to create new hybrid species, all of which are terrifying. There's a delightfully horrific mechanism by which all of this occurs, of course, and I do think it may have given George R.R. Martin a couple of ideas about how to explain the magical crossbreeding on his world. So in the Alien movie, as you remember, the main alien creature is jet black, huge, barbed, serpent-like, with razor-tipped claws and whip tail, and with a few terrifying insect-like features thrown in, such as the protruding, extendable second mandible. Oh yes, and the whole thing is slathered in alien acid mucus, so careful where you put your hands. And speaking of insects, these warrior or drone aliens, we might say, turn out to be the males, who all work in service to a huge queen alien, several times bigger, very much like the queen mother of an ant colony. She lays large eggs, again, as I'm sure you remember, about the size of a kitchen trash can, and from these eggs hatch not baby aliens, but the nasty little things we call the face huggers. And to me, the face huggers are the worst nightmare fuel of anything in these movies, and I'm probably not alone in saying that. They look like a bony cross between a manta ray and a scorpion, with a body just big enough to cover your head and a bunch of nasty, skittery legs to wrap around your skull and give you absolutely no chance to escape while they ram their secret ovipositor down your throat and deposit their little alien spawn in your gut. And yes, the sexual imagery is very much intentional, as this is in fact a form of weird procreation. But as we know, the worst is somehow still yet to come, because you have a baby alien in your belly, and that thing is growing fast. So very fast. It's going to tear its way out of your chest cavity within a day or two, so that's pretty horrifying, but actually no more horrifying than the type of stuff that goes on in nature all the time. Nature, which is famously red in tooth and claw, and ovipositor, and parasitic fungi. But try to remember the first time you saw Alien, when the one guy got that face hugger treatment, and he survived, but nobody knew what would happen next. We hadn't seen any of the main aliens yet, and we didn't know that the facehugger had laid an egg inside that guy. But then he's not feeling well, and we're looking at his stomach, and then comes the horrifying moment, probably the most terrifying moment in the movie, which is the moment you can see something moving inside of him. That horror is followed by the alien bursting out of his chest cavity and skittering away, and now the moviegoer is both terrified and repulsed and fascinated all at the same time. This is the kind of emotional beat in a story that leaves an impression on the viewer, and if the viewer is a writer like George, then he may think about the feeling that such a scene left him with and attempt to recreate it in his own work, in his own setting. That's absolutely what George seems to have done with Septon Barth's reaction to Araya Targaryen, she of the grisly parasitic worm death that was a highlight of Fire and Blood for all of us sick, twisted people. And seriously, it was probably the most talked about thing after Fire and Blood, because, I mean, that sense of ultimate horror that Septon Barth is feeling is also experienced by we, the reader. And it's pretty much the same feeling we had the first time we watched Aliens and the thing burst out of his chest. Parasites are just really terrifying, plain and simple. But when they go from things like tapeworms to xenomorphs, or the dreadful things inside of Araya? Well, it's just not something easily forgotten once heard or seen. So here's the passage, and this comes right after Septon Barth has just watched Araya's eyes burst from the internal heat of her condition.
I thought that was the most hideous thing that I should ever see, but I was quickly disabused of the notion, for a worse horror was awaiting me. That came when Bennifer and I lowered the poor child into a tub and covered her with ice. The shock of that immersion stopped her heart at once, I tell myself. If so, that was a mercy, for that was when the things inside her came out. The things, mother have mercy, I do not know how to speak of them. They were worms with faces, snakes with hands, twisting, slimy, unspeakable things that seemed to writhe and pulse and squirm as they came bursting from her flesh. Some were no bigger than my little finger, but one at least was as long as my arm. Oh, warrior, protect me, the sounds they made.
So Septon Barth's horror here is palpable, and again, I think everyone who read this passage immediately thought of aliens. Araya's story is also interesting because she's just kind of punk rock. She runs away from home by jumping on Balerion the Black Dread and just sort of seeing what happens. But more important for the topic today are the magical implications of this horrific story. Those things that came out of Araya weren't just parasitic worms, and they weren't just fireworms or even parasitic fireworms. At that point, they were worms with human hands and faces, and they were making sounds that frightened Barth, most likely because they sounded vaguely human coming out of their human-like mouths. They might have even sounded like babies crying. So what the hell is going on here? Well, these freaky little fuckers may or may not be the exact same thing as fireworms, the ones that inhabit the volcanoes of Valyria, but they are quite possibly the same thing, and if not, they are very closely related. Araya's worms are in fact cooking her from the inside. They're giving off so much heat that they melt her eyeballs and turn her skin to pork crackling. I'm sorry, but that's what it says. They were ultimately killed by immersing them in ice water, and Septon Barth says,
"They were creatures of heat and fire, and they did not love the ice. Oh no."
So we don't know if they would have been able to breathe fire at some point. Probably not with the human faces, but they didn't get to grow up and fulfill their wormy destiny, so we'll never know. The thing I'm really interested in here are the hands and the faces. Unless George is just trying to be freaky, this is really weird and deserves further scrutiny. This doesn't seem to be the natural state of any sort of stable species, but rather something more along the lines of the malformed dragons and lizard babies. These human-like worms are some sort of mistake, some sort of genetic accident. We've never heard of an animal existing like this, and nor is there need for one to exist. If you're a worm tunneling through earth and rock, or through somebody's insides, there's no evolutionary reason to have a human face. You want a worm face for that, or maybe a mole face. Nature kind of worked all this stuff out already. So it seems possible to me that these worms started out something very like the xenomorph. They were surely very tiny when they got inside Araya, probably inside something she drank or ate while in Valyria, or wherever Balerion took her. It seems like it was either Valyria or perhaps Lothorios. And then these parasites obviously grew inside of her and seemed to have cooked her in the process. But then they emerge with hands and faces. And once we get past the basic freakout factor, which I'm sure you're past by now, right? It's totally cool. We can just be chill with this. We realize that they do in fact qualify as human-animal hybrids. So the blood mages of Valyria created human-animal hybrids by mating humans and animals, supposedly. And in a sense, these worm parasites have, I'm sorry to use the word, but I won't use the word. I won't. They combined their DNA with hers and produced hybrid offspring. We'll just say that. But the point is, this could be the deeper explanation behind the rumors of the Valyrians breeding humans and animals. So if this Dracomorph theory is right, I mean, it's very wrong, but if it's correct, then that means Araya's worms are indeed a species that is capable of combining its DNA with that of its host, just like the xenomorph. That would explain what we see pretty well. It's kind of like Araya's DNA and the worm DNA got thrown into a blender, and out came worms with human hands and faces. Another time, with a different toss of the die, maybe we come out with something a little different. Maybe we get humans with worm arms or something. I don't know. Somebody tell me what the in-between phases were for God Emperor Leto on his way to ultimate worm form. But the point is, if you were willing to keep experimenting in this fashion, you might eventually get something stable, a new species that could eventually reproduce with its own kind. If you're able to get the same result more than once from these grisly experiments that you're doing over and over. Man, what's wrong with you? And kidding aside, of course, when plant or animal breeders breed, they don't just do it once. They do it many, many generations with many, many, many variants, each time selecting the specimens with the most desirable traits to breed again in the subsequent generation. The great empire of the Dawn had centuries and millennia to experiment with this stuff, so it seems that they did. Think about it another way. Something has to explain these worms with hands and faces. Either they always look that way, that's their permanent form, which again doesn't make much sense, or they mutated inside of Aerea and became human-like. The latter choice seems more plausible to me, because as I said, nature has been working on evolving the best worm faces and body features for millions of years, and the place it arrived at is most distinctly not human-like. The same goes for parasitic worms. Human facial features are apparently not useful. And look, I'm not going to put the pictures on the screen because I don't want you to stop watching the video or have nightmares like I did. But I did double check, so take my word for it. Parasitic worms have terrifying hook-covered suckers and things for faces, stuff like that. Again, pure nightmare fuel. And so, if these worms really did combine their DNA with Aerea's DNA, then they are xenomorph-like. They are the Dracomorph. And then we finally have a magical mechanism by which human-animal crossbreeding can actually be achieved through blood magic. Because these worms are in the blood and altering the bloodlines. And yes, we're going to talk about Caraxes the bloodworm in just a moment. But imagine putting some of these worms into a wyvern. Would they come out as hot-blooded worms with wyvern faces and features like wings? Whether or not these wormy parasites, who are also creatures of fire, are the exact same thing as Valyrian fireworms or just something similar, it sure does seem like injecting them into wyverns could get you pretty close to a dragon. The only thing the wyverns are missing is the fiery aspect, and the worms definitely have that. Again, producing enough heat to cook a human being from the inside. And if Aerea's worms really did start out as baby fireworms, then that means the fireworms themselves are the Dracomorph. And to me, this does kind of make for the most coherent version of this theory. After all, the entire point of putting lizard DNA into the Valyrian people is to give them a sort of kinship with the dragons. So if the worms that are used to put that DNA into the Valyrians are actually fireworms, which were also used to create dragons, then it makes sense that you would have that kind of kinship. So it's not just rando salamander DNA or something in the Valyrians, it's actually fireworm DNA. Potentially. And then, of course, the other possibility is just that there are multiple species of fiery worms, with some of them being parasites and some not. Either way, the mere existence of Aerea's worms implies the existence of a kind of weird magical technology that can combine DNA of totally different species, with one of those species being a fiery dragon worm thing. This opens up all kinds of possibilities for crossbreeding hybrid creatures, be it dragons or dragon people or whatever else the Valyrians conjured up on Gogossos, which seems kind of like an even worse version of Dr. Moreau, by the way. And speaking of Gogossos, I'll also mention that Crowfood's daughter thinks that the horrific plague known as the Red Death, which broke out on Gogossos 77 years after the doom and the downfall of the Valyrian Empire, is actually evidence that the Valyrians were using worms to do their crossbreeding on Gogossos. As you can see on the screen, the description of the disease, skin shredding like parchment, blood coming from every orifice, and so on, could potentially be a match for someone experiencing an earlier stage of fireworm infestation, or we might say dying at an earlier stage of the infestation. After all, the Valyrians and Targaryens do seem to have increased tolerance to heat, so it's logical to deduce that the worms were able to incubate inside Aerea for longer than they would have been in a normal human, and thus were able to grow much larger than they would have been inside of a normal human. So perhaps these Red Death victims on Gogossos were infected with worms, but those worms were simply much smaller by the time the host died, and thus weren't noticed in all the blood gushing out of all the orifices. And then there's also the fact that 9 out of 10 people on Gogossos died from the plague, so there weren't many eyewitness accounts, and the ones that we got were probably pretty mangled and filled with horror. In any case, check out Crowfood's daughter's videos if you want more of that. All right. All right, so the next part in this theory is the fact that there are several scenes in The World of Ice and Fire and Fire and Blood, which George basically wrote all of that material at the same time. Several scenes which George seems to have written based on being inspired by aliens and all these xenomorph ideas. First, we have the Targaryen custom of placing dragon's eggs in the cradle with their babies and young children, and this is from Fire and Blood. There were more dragons than ever before as well, as several of the she-dragons were regularly producing clutches of eggs. Not all of these dragons hatched, but many did, and it became customary for the fathers and mothers of newborn princelings to place a dragon's egg in their cradles, following a tradition that Princess Rhaena had begun many years before. The children so blessed invariably bonded with the hatchlings to become dragon riders. So now think of this whole setup in light of the Aliens movies. You have a large egg laid by a monstrous lizard creature waiting to hatch, and a defenseless, helpless person waiting right there when it does. This sure looks a bit like the alien facehugger setup, except for the fact that the baby dragon doesn't hatch and attack the helpless person, except for that one time when it did. I'll put that quote back up on the screen, and as you can see, it says, "The dragon that wriggled from the egg was a monstrosity, a wingless worm, maggot white and blind." And of course, the facehuggers are maggot white as well. Then it says, "Within moments of hatching, the creature turned upon the babe in her cradle and tore a bloody chunk from her arm. As Lena shrieked, Oakenfist ripped the dragon off her, flung it to the floor, etc., etc." All right, so now we're getting closer to the alien setup. This was a deformed dragon that hatched and not a parasitic worm, such as Araya had, but these are both worms, essentially, and they're about the same size. The one that's as long as Barth's arm is probably about the size of something that would come out of a dragon's egg. We have only to imagine that deformed Draco worm hatching in young Lena's cradle as one of Araya's worms to complete the alien egg facehugger scenario. An egg hatches beside a helpless human, a worm comes out and latches onto the human, impregnating them with more parasitic worms, which will combine with the host DNA to make a new hybrid species. And again, even though we probably can't call Araya's worms with hands and faces a stable hybrid offspring, you need to picture the Great Empire of the Dawn Blood Mages performing hundreds or even thousands of these experiments, and perhaps even steering, manipulating, and trying to stabilize things with sorcery. Or don't picture it, just take my word for it. Here's a picture of Matt Smith as Daemon Targaryen as a palate cleanser. All right, the final piece of Dracomorph theory brings us to the Targaryen fathers with a knack for siring lizard babies. Maegor and Daemon. So much for palate cleanser Daemon. Instead, it's worm father Daemon. Sorry. Daemon's dragon, Caraxes, is of course known as the Bloodworm, and George seems to be using Daemon himself to show us about how worms in the blood were used to create dragons, like Caraxes, and Blood of the Dragon people, like Daemon and his various wives. And shout out to everyone who watched my Daemon's Ladies video back in House of the Dragon Season 1. So Daemon's first lizard baby mama is the first Lena Targaryen, the one who did ride Vhagar and who did appear in House of the Dragon, which is looking more like House of the Worm, but I digress. Oh, that's a George Martin short story, isn't it? Here then is the tale from Fire and Blood of Lena's pregnancy and unfortunate death. A day and a night of labor left Lena Velaryon pale and weak, but finally she gave birth to the son Prince Daemon had so long desired. But the babe was twisted and malformed and died within the hour, nor did his mother long survive him. Her grueling labor had drained all of Lady Lena's strength, and grief weakened her still further, making her helpless before the onset of childbed fever. After 3 days of delirium, Lady Lena passed from this mortal coil. She was but 27. During her final hour, it is said, Lady Lena rose from her bed, pushed away the septas praying over her, and made her way from the room, intent on reaching Vhagar, that she might fly one last time before she died. Her strength failed her on the tower steps, however, and it was there she collapsed and died. Now, technically, this baby is not described as lizard-like, only twisted and malformed. But I think we're meant to understand that any sort of deformed Targ baby is usually going to be lizard-like. For example, Daemon's other lizard mama, Rhaenyra, definitely has what is described as a full-on lizard baby, with a scaled tail and everything, which they did reproduce on the show, actually. They just didn't give us a good enough shot of it during the episode. But yeah, Rhaenyra's lizard baby is also described as twisted and malformed, just like Laena's baby. In other words, all of these non-viable, twisted, and deformed Targaryen babies are probably the result of the same thing, which is the fact that the Targaryens are magically engineered lizard people with draconic, wormy DNA swimming in their bloodstream and also their other bodily fluids, as we'll discuss in a moment. Yeah. The fact that Targaryens and dragons alike both occasionally have offspring that revert to their older forms, to their genetic parents, if you will, also demonstrates that these sort of magically engineered hybrid creatures can be a bit unstable. And I don't mean that emotionally, I mean that as in an unstable species. So again, this Laena, who died giving birth to Daemon's lizard baby, is the grandmother of the other Laena, the one who was attacked as a child in the cradle by the deformed worm dragon. However, if we imagine them as the same person and combine their worm stories, we'd have basically a perfect parallel for Arya Targaryen, which calls to mind aliens. We'd have one Laena who was infected with Draco worms as a child, and then who gives birth to a Draco worm as an adult. And some of you may have noticed that the detail about the first Laena collapsing on the steps while trying to reach her dragon for one last ride is very similar to Arya's death, which came after she dismounted her dragon on her last dragon ride. Arya collapsed on the steps of Dragonstone, and Laena on the steps of Driftmark, so pretty similar. And then we have Daemon and Rhaenyra's lizard baby. On Dragonstone, no cheers were heard. Instead, screams echoed through the halls and stairwells of Sea Dragon Tower, down from the Queen's apartments where Rhaenyra Targaryen strained and shuddered in her third day of labor. The child had not been due for another turn of the moon, but the tidings from King's Landing had driven the princess into a black fury, and her rage seemed to bring on the birth, as if the babe inside her were angry too and fighting to get out. The princess shrieked curses all through her labor, calling down the wrath of the gods upon her half-brothers and their mother, the queen, and detailing the torments she would inflict upon them before she would let them die. She cursed the child inside her too, Mushroom tells us, clawing at her swollen belly as Maester Gerardus and her midwife tried to restrain her and shouting, "Monster! Monster! Get out! Get out! Get out!" When the babe at last came forth, she proved indeed a monster, a stillborn girl, twisted and malformed, with a hole in her chest where her heart should have been, and a stubby, scaled tail. Or so Mushroom describes her. The dwarf tells us that it was he who carried the little thing to the yard for burning. Alright, so once again I say, this is a scene that would seem to be inspired by aliens, right? There's a monster inside of her fighting to get out, a monster which is part human and part Draco worm. Rhaenyra's terror and anger at the monster trying to fight its way out of her is basically a perfect match to the scene from Aliens. Although Rhaenyra was, of course, able to survive the experience. One other note on Daemon Targaryen, father of lizard babies. His first love interest in the story was Mysaria, the white worm. So, Daemon bonded with a worm dragon, made love to a worm woman, and then went on to have two, not quite worm children, but some sort of deformed lizard-human hybrid children. And Maegor, well, he's definitely got worms in the blood and, again, the other bodily fluids. 3 moons before she was due, Queen Jane was brought to bed by a sudden onset of labor pains, and was delivered of a stillborn child as monstrous as the one Alice Haraway had birthed, a legless and armless creature possessed of both male and female genitalia. Nor did the mother long survive the child. Maegor was cursed, men said. He had slain his nephew, made war against the faith and the High Septon, defied the gods, committed murder and incest, adultery and rape. His privy parts were poisoned, his seed full of worms. The gods would never grant him a living son, or so the whispers ran. Maegor himself settled on a different explanation and sent Sir Owen Bush and Sir Maladon Moore to seize Queen Tyanna and deliver her to the dungeons. There, the Pentoshi Queen made a full confession, even as the king's torturers readied their implements. She had poisoned Jane Westerling's child in the womb, just as she had Alice Haraway's. It would be the same with Eleanor Costain's whelp, she promised. It is said that the king slew her himself, cutting out her heart with black fire and feeding it to his dogs. But even in death, Tiana of the Tower had her revenge, for it came to pass just as she had promised. The moon turned and turned again, and in the black of night, Queen Eleanor too was delivered of a malformed and stillborn child, an eyeless boy born with rudimentary wings. All right, class, what do we say about confessions obtained under torture or threat of torture? That's right, we say they're not worth much. And I, for one, do not buy for a second that Tiana of the Tower had the power. Hey, Tower of Power. Yeah, smoking on the best weed. Sorry, Tiana of the Tower. I don't think she had the power to turn a normal child into a lizard baby. And I don't think Miri Maz-Dur had that power either. Targaryens have lizard babies because they have lizard DNA. And Maegor, in particular, seems like a bit of a mutant. He was potentially conceived with sorcery and might not even have any of Aegon's DNA in him. He might be a Visenya self-conception. I need to make a video about that, a Visenya gecko theory that's called. And then Maegor also grew up freakishly fast and strong. He obviously went more than a little crazy. And most importantly, he was seemingly incapable of siring any normal children whatsoever. Oh, but Tiana of the Tower predicted Eleanor's baby would be a lizard baby too, and she was right. She must have done it. Well, guess what? That's kind of like predicting that you're going to have a stomach ache after eating a bowl of brown in a flea-bottom pot shop. Or like predicting that Grey Waist Tim is going to mention H.P. Lovecraft when he comes on my channel on Sundays at 1 p.m. Pacific. See you there. Point is, you don't need to make any special arrangements to make something like that come true. And if Maegor were still around, trying to sire normal human children, we'd be on pretty safe ground predicting that, it's going to be a lizard baby. In other words, it does seem that Maegor had wormy seed, so to speak. His dragon DNA was just too concentrated to produce viable human offspring. And so the women infected with Maegor's symbolically wormy seed gave birth to monsters, with the first one really looking like a worm, armless and legless. And just to be clear, I'm not saying that Maegor was infected with the same parasite that Arya had, but rather that Martin is using this entire story, just like with Daemon's story, to sketch out the mechanics of Dracomorph hybridization. He's essentially using Maegor and Daemon to hint at the idea of worms being the magical means by which dragon-human hybrids can be created, and dragons as well. He's shown us that both dragons and Blood of the Dragon people have offspring that seem to revert to worm traits from time to time, betraying the secrets of their hybrid engineering. Oh, and by the way, it's maybe a coincidence, but maybe not. The first name of Lieutenant Ripley in Aliens? It's Ellen. Ellen Ripley, as in Eleanor Costain, the mother of Maegor's final lizard baby. So again, that may just be a coincidence, but all in all, it really does seem like George has been inspired by aliens when writing these scenes that we've mentioned today. And I think he's done more than simply importing the terror and body horror of those movies into A Song of Ice and Fire. He's imported the xenomorph mechanism itself. And there you have it. Dracomorph theory. The only explanation that I've ever heard for exactly how wyverns and fireworms might have been crossbred, and also how humans and apparently parasitic fireworms were crossbred to create the blood of the dragon. As always, let me know in the comments, and also check out the video Dreams Come From Dragons if you're curious about the other side of the dragon bond. Namely, the idea that there are spirits of Valyrian ancestors inside the dragons, and that this is part of what helps create the spirit link part of the dragon bond. So the dragon lords have some dragon DNA inside them, and the dragons have some human spirit inside them, and that's essentially how I think it works. So thanks for watching, and if you'd like to support the channel beyond the normal clicking like and subscribing and leaving comments, thank you very much, then do check out our new and improved Patreon campaign linked in the description below, where you can win free t-shirts and get access to our gallery of commissioned artwork, downloadable in high res, as well as access to our friendly neighborhood Discord. So again, thank you and cheers, and I'll see you next time.